Hello, and welcome to the Path of Maximum Resistance. This is a little video series that is sort of the story of my life and the choices that I have made that life a little bit more difficult than it probably needed to be or needs to be, but also hopefully makes for some interesting stories, which I can now share with you. As this series has been going along, we've talked a lot about my war stories from my 2 combat tours of Iraq. Talked a little bit about like personal conditions, afflictions, I guess you could say, alcoholism, PTSD, depression, some things I've sort of battled with that I think, I'd like to discuss just to bring awareness to. I think it's important. Today we're going to go back down the route of sort of a combat story, sort of a war story. I want to talk to you about Baghdad, Iraq. I just want to describe Baghdad to people who've never been there. And as I think about it, I think this is going to be a much more difficult subject than I maybe originally anticipated. And I think that's because, as I think about it, in trying to describe what Baghdad's like, there's a bunch of obstacles. First of all, if you've never been to any place like Baghdad, it's hard for me to make a comparison. So, say if I was trying to describe to you California, so long as you have been to America or to a Western country at all, I can describe California to you relative to what the rest of the United States is like. I can tell you the differences, how it's the same, how it's similar, how it's unique, and you might be able to get an idea of California based on that. It's not so easy to do with Iraq or with a place like Baghdad because it lacks similarities in some ways, and in some ways it's more similar to places in the United States than you might expect, which brings us to the next difficulty, and that's preconceived biases. I know I certainly had my preconceived notions of what I thought Baghdad was going to be like before I got there, and in many respects it was totally different, but in some respects the same. And I know that as I discuss Baghdad with you, especially looking back, because the Baghdad I'm describing is from a certain time period, and so I'm going to be trying to describe a place to you that you might have some preconceived idea of what you think it's like. And for this to work, what I'd ask you to do is kind of open your mind and allow me to give you the visualization of what that city is actually like, and hopefully we can build something that's actually a realistic reflection of what I experienced. It's actually a third difficulty, and it goes along with those preconceived notions, is that I'm going to be describing Baghdad from a specific period in time. I was only there for about 8 months, maybe a little bit less, but I was there in 2003, obviously as in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom Uno, number 1. And I'm guessing Baghdad was significantly different in the decades leading up to 2003 under, the reign of Saddam Hussein, and I'm sure it's significantly different now. And I somewhat keep tabs on it. I actually go on Snapchat and Instagram and check out Baghdad stories pretty often, just because I find it all fascinating. But that does make a difficulty in that it's going to be hard for me to make any general sweeping, or let me kind of restate that, any sweeping generalizations about Baghdad, because I'm only actually telling you about Baghdad at a specific period in time. So please keep that in mind. We're talking about Baghdad 2003 and nothing more, nothing else. It's just my experience during that time. One thing that you guys might be looking forward to is that since I'm talking about Baghdad, unlike the rest of the tales that I've told on this video series so far, you might be thinking, yay, we're going to avoid the topic of alcohol, which seems to be prevalent in every other video log I've done so far. But you'd be incorrect. I managed to get my hands on alcohol in Baghdad as well. So I actually have at least 2 stories involving that, one of which is pretty crazy, and the other one actually has some sort of historical significance to it, and is actually more of an important story, so it goes hand in hand. But the other one's just a fun soldierly story that I would like to tell about the sort of mischievous ways of soldiers left to their own devices in a combat area, and it does involve alcohol, and it's a pretty crazy one, and I think you'll get a kick out of it. So that's sort of the plan for today. I have, as I did last time, some notes here on my phone, so every once in a while if you see me referring down, that's why. I'm not avoiding eye contact with you, I'm just looking down at my notes, so to make sure we stay on track. I do want to do one sort of administrative task, some house cleaning real quick. I want to tell you guys that I have built a preliminary website to support this project. The link will be down in the information or the description for this video. The website address, the URL, is maxresistanceblog, all one word, maxresistanceblog.com. Maxresistanceblog.com. Again, you'll be able to see it in the information below this video. So if you want to check out that site, it has some links to like my social media and other ways you can get a hold of me. I'll be perpetually improving that site, adding more features, making it more community oriented. But for now, it's just a collection of sort of repository of the videos, and it has some links where we can get in contact, and it's good enough for now. So I wanted to bring that to your attention, and I hope you would check it out. And more importantly is that here on YouTube, you subscribe to the channel, and if you really want to be cool, you will click on the little notification bell so that every time I publish a video, you'll be notified. So I think as far as administrative purposes goes, that takes care of what we needed to do, and I can start telling you some Baghdad stories. So let's start actually at a period before Baghdad. I want to bring it back a little bit because there's something very important, historically significant about the perception of Baghdad, or the overwhelming sort of emotion I had in entering Baghdad that I can only tell to you by first conveying what was going on prior to getting to Baghdad. As I had sort of mentioned in episodes before, the very beginning of the war, the very beginning of the OIF-1, we actually, the 3rd Infantry Division, of which I was a part of, we spent most of our time just driving north. And prior to the war, we'd actually lived in Kuwait for 6 months. So you have to imagine that for a pretty long time, those of us who were heading our way up into Baghdad had lived in just desert. And when I describe, or when I talk about the Kuwaiti desert, it's desert of like the most stereotypical sense. I've been to other places, like, I live in California now, so as I was driving out to California, I had to cut through the Mojave, and that's certainly a desert too, but to me it's not the desert in the sense of what you would think about in a movie. Kuwait is very much sand dunes, like sidewinder snakes, scorpions, all the things that you would think about in a desert environment. It's just the desert. It's like what you would see in a movie. It's what you would stereotypically think of when you think of a sandy dunes desert. So that's what we had seen in Kuwait for a very long period, and we had gotten really accustomed to that, and desert life was pretty much our norm. As you're going north, and you're getting just closer, you're creeping closer to the southern edge of Baghdad, there's actually a level of Iraq, and I'm not sure if it goes across the entire breadth of the country, but for a large period, or a large stretch of the country, at least as far as I could see in my truck, there is this ledge. It's kind of called the escarpment. Basically, for whatever reason, I'm not sure if it's like a fault plane, or I'm not sure what the topography or the sort of geological entity that's going on here, or like what the situation is. But basically, more or less, you go from a low level of elevation, and then there's just like a direct steep hill, then you go up on another plane and plateau. It's almost like Iraq jumps up a level at this one portion. It's really significant, it's really noticeable, and you just see it. Like, you see this hill coming from a ways away. So as you're driving, it's all desert. You've seen nothing but desert. Suddenly, you go up this hill, and as you get to the top of the hill, and here's where it starts breaking into Baghdad, literally in front of you, you see green for the first time. And it's pretty cool, because even as like a 19-year-old in combat, or in Iraq, in that situation for the first time, being as immature as I was, it wasn't lost on me the significance of where we were at geographically. And that's the cradle of civilization. This is Babylon. This is like the Fertile Crescent. This is literally where history, societal history, has sort of started, as far as we know. And maybe that's incorrect, who knows, but the historical significance is there, and to me it was pretty overwhelming. You come up over this hill, you've seen nothing but desert for the past 6 months, maybe even longer, and then suddenly you literally see green grass. It's really kind of cool. Like, you can literally see like what is the Fertile Crescent. which like it sticks in my mind. It's something that had a significant impact, and I actually remember like as we were rolling in, I legitimately thought about that. I was like, wow, this is like you literally see the birthplace. You see in the vegetation becoming green, you see life developing, and you can kind of draw a what's the word I'm looking for there? Like not a synonym, but a can't think of the word I'm looking for, but you can kind of make a comparison in seeing the green grass and kind of draw it to like civilization itself and think about like this is where it's all born, this is where it's all developed from. So yeah, it's pretty cool. It's actually really cool. So anyway, so that kind of gets us, south of Baghdad. We're going up into Baghdad, and this is in March of, like I said, 2003. And let me tell you at first, so to give you a general sense, and it's crazy to talk about now because time has changed so many things, but first you should know that Baghdad originally, so after the invasion, there was a period of time where Baghdad was sort of calm, and in fact, there was like a 2-week period where Baghdad was like really calm and actually relatively safe. And it's interesting to think about where our mind was at the time, because we have the luxury of hindsight now. But when we first sort of took Baghdad and got established there, Baghdad looked good. Like it looked like the war was over. If you think back to like the president at the time with his mission accomplished banner on that aircraft carrier, I mean, you really had that sense. Like Baghdad, there was looting going on, there was economical issues for the Iraqis, but it relatively seemed calm. Like it wasn't a war zone anymore. And it's really crazy to think about how everything worked out, because again, we are perceiving everything I tell you is going to be through the perception of the here and now. But please take your mind back to 2003. Like, for example, we now know in the Iraq War, a lot of the conflict, or a lot of the weapon of choice of the enemy has been improvised explosive devices. Basically roadside bombs and suicide bombs and stuff like that. You wouldn't believe this, but in 2003, that wasn't even a concern. They hadn't become prevalent yet. Like when we were actually going into Baghdad, that's not something that we were really warned about significantly. Like we talked about it, but it wasn't something that was as prevalent as a threat as it would be now. It wasn't like an ingrained tactic of the enemy then. That's something that's become more popular as the war is going on. So you have to remember, when we took Baghdad and we were first living there, like we still envisioned war as being like guerrilla warfare in the streets, small arms fire. So we weren't really worried about IEDs so much. In fact, it's crazy because as the war went on, we started to up armor our Humvees. Well, initially, when we first got to Baghdad, the actual impetus was to do the opposite. Trucks were actually taking their doors off. We were actually trying to make them as open as possible, because the theory was the more guns we could get like out the door, the more of a weapon our vehicle became, and we weren't concerned about getting like blown up. It just wasn't a concern then. Like Baghdad was totally different. And that's part of something I need to tell you, because you need to put your mind back in 2003 and think about what it was like then and not sort of perceive it from where we stand now, because it's a totally different story. So Baghdad itself, well, first of all, let me kind of tell you how we were situated. So my unit, as I've referenced before, our main duty was to guard the 2nd Brigade Tactical Operations Center. So basically we guarded the headquarters for the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division. Wasn't the most glory-seeking task. In fact, I would say that like within our unit, within my platoon, there were some trucks that were tasked out to do like more adventurous missions, more combat-oriented missions. And I'll say that like our truck wasn't. Like, I don't know, maybe we had a reputation of being sort of slackers in a sense. I mean, it is what it is, but in any case, our job was to guard the TOC. And I wish I could tell you cooler stories and tell you that like we were going on secret squirrel missions, doing crazy stuff, but we really weren't. We were guarding the TOC. I mean, there seems to be, I notice when a lot of, and man, I hate calling people out like this, but I know when a lot of people tell their stories, there's this natural tendency to sort of overemphasize your own participation in events. But my goal is to always tell you my stories. I'm not going to ever take away from them, but you can't trust me if I'm not being honest with you. So I'm not ever going to, like when I told you the story about the core Lurs guys, I wanted to make it very clear that like my truck didn't actually go on the mission to evacuate the people. Anyway, I'm not going to digress too far here, but my point is to convince you that everything I tell you is like as true as I remember it being. And I'm trying not to emphasize anything, and if I do kind of ever overemphasize something, I'll try to tell you that, like, hey, I'm kind of highlighting this part, though I didn't participate in it directly because I wanted to make a point. But I try not to do that, and when I do, I want to be very explicit about it. But in any case, this certainly wasn't it. We had this pretty mundane task of guarding the 2nd Brigade TOC. But the cool part about that is that we lived in Saddam Hussein's palace. It was really pretty cool. And I've actually had so Saddam had multiple palaces, so it's actually hard if you Google it to find the specific palace that we lived in. But I've been able to track it down, and hopefully I'll remember to link it either on the website, maxresistanceblog.com, or in the information below this video. I'll link to that palace. It was really neat. Like, I mean, it was a palace, like huge sort of castle-looking place. Its backyard, and by yard I mean multiple lots, it probably took up a few acres, and the back of it abutted right up on the Tigris River. This is right in Baghdad, by the way. The palace itself was kind of like, it had the shape of the White House in a sense, but much bigger. Like, it was just bigger in size, but the same sort of thing, like a big portico type thing up front, where like a driveway would kind of come in and you would circle under the portico, had like a big chandelier that hung down. The interesting part is, of course, there was a huge rocket hole in it. So the American military had, shot a rocket into this place. And of course, someone was in there before us and made sure it was all clear. But there literally was like a rocket hole, like as you would imagine in the movies, like in the side of this building, a huge hole, and then everything was collapsed from there in. But we took over this palace. It was really cool. We were able, basically we had the run of it. If you were willing, so you have to remember, or you have to figure that there's debris everywhere. Like this place had been ransacked, and it's just like everything had collapsed, and it was pretty run down. But basically we were allowed, if we were willing to clean things up and sweep it, and get rid of debris, that's where we would live. So I actually like lived in one of Saddam Hussein's like bedrooms. Amazing, like I'm not even kidding you, gold-plated toilets. Like none of it worked, obviously the water and electricity, none of that was operational, but it was as ornate as you might imagine it being. It was literally like a dictator's palace, and I lived in it. We had our own bedroom that we swept up, we cleaned up. We actually took us days, and I'll never forget because we only had access to like certain tools. So we literally, one of my teammates and I, we swept this entire room with just like a regular broom. And like imagine, we're sweeping like huge cement blocks worth of rubble from, wartime destruction. It was almost like, and in fact there was parts where we did take a toothbrush out and we're polishing things, and that's because we had nothing but time. I think we went on, I don't even remember what our mission was at the time, other than guarding the TOC. We were kind of just chilling out, to be really honest. So we had nothing but time. So literally to take the time to sweep this entire room, I mean, it might have taken us like a week, and we were just like happy to do it, because what else were we going to do? So we lived in Saddam Hussein's palace. That was pretty crazy. This is in what became the Green Zone. At the time, the Green Zone didn't exist. This is right when we took Baghdad. And the other fascinating part about it is that the army was actually functioning like an army then. And to those of you who have served, and especially those of you who have deployed, you might relate to this as I sort of elaborate a little bit. But as the war became more established, the army started doing less and less of like the peripheral activities. So, for example, once Iraq got established as, we had like a stronghold there, we started having contractors who would cook our food, for example, and contractors who would do maybe some security, or they would build stuff for us. They would do construction and engineering and stuff like that. At Saddam's palace, at the very beginning of the war, it was still like the army. Like, we actually had army cooks who set up like their truck, and they had, you know, like their makeshift cooking area. So we actually had real army cooks cooking our food. Like, our communications equipment was all really old school, like the green army phones. It was all very army. It just felt like something. It was sort of like old time combat logistics meets new time, or modern times. Like, we hadn't quite caught up to the times yet. It was 2003, yet we didn't have the digital technology, at least not like at my level, we didn't. So it was still like this old Vietnam style army supporting this new modern environment. It was a really neat sort of clash of paradigms, and I got to like sit right in the middle of it. It was pretty cool. But I doubt we'll ever see that again. We'll never see like the army function as an army. Everything is contracted out now, and it's a totally different story. It's just totally different. So I feel like I got to experience like that last little instance of like the army really like just being an army. But that being said, so Baghdad was pretty calm. We live in Saddam's palace. I do have a cool story about that, and it's the first story that kind of alludes to alcohol. But it's worth hearing, so bear with me here. So the way this palace was set up, so you have Saddam's palace, which is this giant, big, monolithic building. It's one big building. Where the rocket had come through, just to give you some idea of how this building is situated, up in the roof was actually a swimming pool. Like, a swimming pool on the very top floor is what they had, and like that's what the top floor consisted of, was a swimming pool. But the rocket had like gone right through it and like drained it out and flooded everything. So obviously the pool wasn't working. But it gives you an idea of how ornate this place was. Just massively big. On each side of the palace were basically row houses, like townhouses, like the same houses you would see in America, but they were all connected, and they were all, though they looked like multiple houses, in the inside of them they were all connected, so they're all one house. And these were actually the houses where Saddam Hussein's sons lived, Uday and Qusay. Pretty cool. So Uday's house, so Uday was a psycho. Let me tell you. So like, I can personally tell you Uday was a psycho, and I'll test that, and I'll give you some evidence. So the house in one direction were all Uday's houses. So there was one day I had some time. We went to go inspect these houses, and to be very honest with you, like, no one had really been through these houses yet. Like, the CIA hadn't really been through them, the State Department people hadn't been through them, the special ops guys hadn't been through them, and the reason I know that because I actually went through the houses with them. The one time, I shouldn't say the only time, but the most interaction I've ever had in my life with like secret squirrels, sort of really cool guy, like top secret type people, was in Uday's house. After we had been in the palace for a couple of days, we had nothing to do, so I was like, I got permission from my teammates, and I was like, I'm gonna go check out Uday's house. So I don't know who was with me. I actually don't remember there being much of anyone with me, but I was over in Uday's house. I'm sure I had some teammates with me. And it was cool because like, it was my team. Like I said, I don't remember if my team, for some reason I can't picture my team being there, but I was there. But then the people that we would run into, and it was just the coolest environment. Like, you'd run into like these SF guys, these special forces dudes, and they're all dressed in like civilian clothes. And just like everyone you walked into had a story. Like, you'd bump into someone and be like, who are you? And this guy'd be like, oh, I'm with the State Department, blah, blah, blah. Or like, you run into someone else and like, who are you? And he's like, oh, Central Intelligence. I'm not kidding you. These are the type of people. And they're all just like running around this housing complex. It was just this surreal moment. Surreal for me because I'm into that. Like, I'm easily starstruck when it comes to like that lifestyle. Those people are my heroes. So being in this building, running through it with them, was just like, I was on cloud 9. So the significant things about Uday's house, and here's how I can tell you that he's insane, is because he had paintings of himself throughout the house. In fact, he had statues. He was obsessed with lions. And I can tell you he was obsessed with lions because he had pet lions. And I'll get to that. But he had paintings all over his house of him. And in these paintings, it was like him like harassing women and like him choking women and him like being sort of dominant over women. These paintings were action pictures of him doing very obscene things to women. He had statues of lions. Like I said, he was obsessed with lions, but all of their heads, instead of being lions' heads, were his head. Dude was crazy. In his backyard, so you remember, we have no map of this place. We have no idea what we're going to run into. We're just walking through Uday's place. His backyard, he actually had his own little zoo. And in this zoo were a couple lions. And like, I'm not kidding. So like, this is Baghdad. And I'm trying to set this up for you. So you have this palace, you have these row houses. In the backyard of the row houses is basically groves of like palm trees, but then beyond the palm trees is a Tigris River. And then in these backyards, you just have all of a sudden a zoo. Like cages and an actual zoo. So imagine like a zoo in some dude's backyard. And in this zoo were caged lions. They weren't doing very well. They had been neglected, clearly. I'm guessing like Saddam and his kids have run away from this palace well before the war started. So these lions had been kind of like just chilling in their cages. So, you know, they were disease looking, had flies. But for you animal lovers out there, this isn't a sad story. About the animals, at least, because someone had posted a note on the lion's cage. And by someone, I mean the Special Forces guys, because they had a note that said something like, and I can't remember it verbatim, but it's like, if you mess with these lions, you'll be the lion's next meal. Love Special Forces. So the Special Forces guys actually took over those lions and like made them their own. And I remember listening to like the Brigade Net, and on the Brigade Net, like everyone would check in, like I would just listen to it, and like they would do what they call their battle update brief, and like different units would check in and give their progress reports. And basically, like when the SF guys would get on, they'd be like, the lions are still doing good. So yeah, those lions had they end up being taken care of. So anyway, we're going through Uday's house. So many things, like he had an underground walkway that went under his backyard, and as you came back up, you actually came into another external building, which was his like clothing. He just had like a house full of clothes, like designer clothes. I've actually read about it since then. They're actually all knockoff clothes, I guess, but they were all like Armani suits or pseudo Armani suits, but just very lavish clothing. And I've seen it's crazy to Google these things now, because if you Google them, I can see pictures of Uday standing in the places I've been to, and just given how weirdly crazy that guy was, it's insane to think I have been to places where he's been. But I can even, my relationship to Uday gets even more intertwined as I go further into the story. So he has this building with all his clothes, he has stuff like that. And going back to his house, now this is the part where most people would get interested, but I had a slightly different interest. But in the basement of his house, and it was crazy because it felt really dangerous because the roof was kind of collapsed in, like some bombs had hit the building. But in the basement of his house was an armory, and it had just guns as far as the eyes could see. I mean, it was just a room full of guns. He had these bullpups, which are basically, I can't describe what makes a bullpup significant other than like the way the trigger is sort of oriented. It's ahead of parts, like usually like the magazine is behind the trigger, so it's sort of oriented a little bit differently than your typical weapon. The fact that he had bullpups wasn't so significant. It's that he had gold-plated bullpups. Like, they were all in cases. They were 24. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know anything about gold, so when I say 24 karat, they were gold. And these SF guys, they literally were coming in with garbage bags and like just taking weapons and throwing them in garbage bags and walking out. I, on the other hand, had no interest in these guns, except for one. I lied. I did take one gun. He had a 50 cal. He had many 50 cal Desert Eagles, and I did take a 50 cal Desert Eagle that I ended up firing later on, just for fun. Massive gun, just insane. So I had Uday's Desert Eagle for a while. I used to carry it on me all the time. Yeah, but the more interesting part for me is as we're walking through Uday's house, I get to a room that's like his bar. And of course, like I said, everything comes back to alcohol for me. And he actually had a room where he had all kinds of liquors and like where he must have partied, and like he had his servers and everything. And there was a bottle of Goldschlager. And and it was open. So in my head, I tell myself that Uday drank from this bottle. I don't know. Someone drank from it. It had been drank from. It was open, and I took it along with a bunch of other bottles of alcohol. And one night we partied, and I drank Uday's Goldschlager. So in my head, my interaction with Uday is that I've drank from the same bottle of Goldschlager as him. I don't know if that's true, but it makes for a better story. So when I tell you I wasn't going to lie, I'm not lying there. And if I'm exaggerating, maybe I'm filling in some details of a story, but I think you can see why I'm doing it. So in any case, it was Uday's. It was in Uday's house. I took it. Everyone else was taking weapons out. Everyone else was taking these cool artifacts. I end up with a bunch of bottles of alcohol. Story of my life. The other cool things is we found he had a room full of trophies and stuff like that, and he had a bowling ball that was actually etched to him from a senator in the United States. It was to beloved Uday from senator, and I can't remember the name. He had all these pictures of him interacting with American dignitaries, which made it really interesting. One, he had a swimming pool which was out of water. It was dry. I actually bowled a bowling ball into the swimming pool, and it hit the ground and shattered and put a little crack in the swimming pool. So all these little details that come back to me that have no significance in the world, but that's what it looked like. So you have Saddam's palace, you have Uday's houses, and that kind of gives you a synopsis of what our living condition in Baghdad looked like at the time. So Baghdad at that time, like I was saying, was pretty safe. In fact, we used to go on missions throughout the city, and this is crazy to think about. And I know people who have served, especially in time after, as the war got more established, they're going to hear these stories and think they're not believable, because there's certain things in combat that are true. You always go out in groups. In your trucks, you always have at least 2 trucks, and usually a whole convoy. There was a time in Baghdad where things were so relatively safe in 2003 that we would just take our truck out. And sometimes it wasn't totally authorized. We would just go out and just take our truck out. We would sneak out. And I'm not even kidding. It was just a different situation. It didn't feel like war for a while. You get comfortable in your surroundings. I have stories about complacency. I've been on the gun of a truck asleep in Fallujah because complacency is real. And you just have to put yourself in that situation. Anywhere you're at, you're living life. So as dangerous and as violent and as crazy as Baghdad 2003 seems, at the time, in the context of everything else, it felt pretty normal. So the big things then, for entertainment, we used to watch DVDs. We had portable DVD players. And Baghdad, a lot of the citizens in Baghdad had made their, I shouldn't say made their living, but what they were doing is they were selling bootleg copies of movies that they burnt on the DVDs. And so we would literally get in our truck and sneak out of the palace and go buy bootleg movies. That's where we were going. That would be our reason for leaving. But the reason I tell you that is because downtown Baghdad, and Baghdad is a huge city, first of all, massively huge, just like any American city. So for me to say anything about Baghdad in monolithic terms doesn't do it justice, because it's neighborhoods. There are neighborhoods in Baghdad that were awful, and then neighborhoods in that same city that were totally fine. Just because the city was so expansive that, in some areas it would be secure, and other areas would be the complete opposite of that. So in the green zone type area, which originally, when we were there, the green zone wasn't established yet. We called that area Center City Baghdad. And to describe it to you, it's more, Center City Baghdad 2003 was more like an American city than it was not like an American city. And I mean that in the sense that downtown had restaurants and stores and all of the things that you would imagine in a regular American city. And this actually brings me to a story that I'm really excited to tell you, and it's one of the more fulfilling things that's ever happened to me in my entire life. So but you have to understand Baghdad. So what we used to do is we used to go to downtown Baghdad, and we would literally go out to eat. In downtown Baghdad, there were actual restaurants. You would sit down, you would take your equipment off, you would eat food, you'd have a waiter who would serve you, just like a regular restaurant, just like any place else. You would pay with money, just like anywhere else. The only difference being is that we would have to drive out there, so we couldn't you can't really lock conveys. I mean, you can, but you can't just leave your Humvee unsecured, right? So Baghdad at the time was so safe. We would just leave one person in the Humvee, and like people would rotate into the restaurant. And this is the same. We didn't just go to the restaurants. We'd also go and get our hair cut. I used to have an Iraqi man who would cut my hair, and he would actually use a straight edge in the back of my neck, which should tell you you're feeling pretty safe if you're willing to be that vulnerable. Like, we didn't even think about it. Like, Baghdad was really safe for a few weeks. But getting to that story, so we're in downtown Baghdad. My teammates are actually inside the restaurant eating, and I was tasked out with actually guarding the truck. So I'm sitting there, I'm actually up in the gun, and the funny part is in our Humvees, and this will not be funny to anyone who hasn't served in the military, but if you have served, my unit then actually had M60s on the top of our truck, which is like the most outdated weapon. In fact, there are people who would see, like, elder soldier would see an M60 and they'd be like, is that a hog? Like, and I guess that's the nickname for the M60. Like, I thought we got rid of them in Vietnam. For some reason, our unit had them, and so we had those instead of like Ma Deuces, or instead of like 50 cals, or or even instead of 249s, we had an M60. Insane. So, anyways, I'm up there on the M60, just sitting there. I'm really just kind of chilling out, just doing much of nothing. And this is really cool. Like in Iraqi, and Iraqis would come up to you like they're just normal people and kind of talk to you or whatever. And so I'm sitting in my truck, and this Iraqi dude walks up to the truck, and he's like, hello, and we're talking or whatever, and he's like, will you please hold my daughter? You think about that. So he has a little kid, and I'll never forget this. His little daughter, he hands his daughter to me, and this grown, like, Iraqi man who has probably seen so much of life and lived through so much more than I had, and at the time I was like 19, he hands me his daughter, and like he's crying, and he's like, I just want my daughter to be in the arms of the heroes who saved us from Saddam. Think about that. Like, there was a moment in time where I truly felt like we were doing the right thing. And I'm not going to use this podcast, at least not today, to delve into the misgivings of what we were doing and whether it was justified or whatever. But for that one moment, everything felt pretty right in the world. And I felt like a hero. Like, I felt really good about myself. And it was a really touching moment. And it was really cool. And it was super cool. So I'm holding this little girl, and he just, like, it wasn't like we had camera phones back then. It wasn't he was like taking a picture. He just wanted that moment. He just wanted, as an American soldier, to hold his kid, and that was it. Like, he gave his daughter back, and that was the entirety of the moment. But it's one that rests, like, in my heart, and I'll never forget it. And like, it was like we felt like we were doing the right thing at the time, which was pretty cool. All right. So I need to kind of skip ahead here. We've been spending a lot of time, and I have a couple stories to tell you that are less about like Baghdad, but more of just like some soldierly craziness that had gone on. And I think I'll go. Let me tell you a quick kind of war story, just to maybe get the raise up the energy level here a little bit. Like I said, Baghdad was pretty safe at the time, so we didn't get into a whole lot of engagements. And after a while, we ended up outside of Fallujah. We actually moved from Baghdad. So this story, and I'm telling you stories that are from 15 years ago, so I might be conflating a couple things here. So we might have actually been near Fallujah when this happened. But one engagement that we did have, for some reason, our truck, I'm not even sure what our mission was, but our truck was sitting on a road along with like 2 or 3 other trucks. So we were basically on this Iraqi road in our truck. I'm sitting in the driver's seat. My team leader, Phil, is in the passenger seat, like a team leader always is, and we have a guy up in the gun, Mike. And I don't even remember what we were doing, but we were just sitting there, and it's like this open road, and then to one side of us is a field with like grass, just like high reeds, sort of like enough to where if you were to stand in this field, the grass would probably be up to your waist or so, as far as I remember, and it went like that for a while. And on the other side of us might have been like a grove of trees or something. So it was like a rural area with a paved road that we were just sitting on. And from the grass, from the high grass, like the meadow, as we're just sitting there, and again, I don't even remember what our intent was, suddenly we hear a like something cutting through the wind. And like again, the significant stories that have happened in my life, like all the periphery, I can't remember very well, but some instances I remember perfectly. And this is one. You hear this thing cutting through the wind, you look over, and like in slow motion, we literally see an RPG flying at us. Not even kidding. Like an RPG coming at our truck. It dives, and the RPG head actually goes under our Humvee. I'm no weapons expert. I don't know how a lot of this stuff works, but as I understand it, there's some kind of material in an RPG head that cracks, and when it cracks, it detonates the explosive device. And whatever that material is, that crystal or whatever that's in the head, it didn't break, and so this round didn't detonate. It was literally sitting under our truck. Like if it would have hit our truck, it would have definitely have taken out our team leader and probably the guy in the gun, and I probably would have gotten shrapnel. But instead, it didn't detonate. So we have no idea where this round came from, other than it came from that meadow. And so first of all, we just start shooting. Like it was the most irresponsible thing. We just started firing into this field everywhere. Like they were up on the gun. I remember at first I wasn't shooting, and someone was like yelling at me, like, "Why don't you fire?" And I'm like, "What are we firing at? I don't even know what I'm shooting at." But eventually, I just started throwing rounds down range. Like that's what you kind of do. And suddenly, we see someone like way in the distance, and this is kind of the cool part. That actually, looking back, felt like a movie. And this was one of the more, as testosterone-filled adventures go, one of the more fun things that end up happening in Iraq. We see some guy like run to his car way in the distance. And we're pretty sure he was probably the guy who shot at us, just because there wasn't a whole lot of people. Like, yeah, we had good sense that this was probably the guy. And I'm the truck driver, so we see this guy jump in his car, and my teammate's like, "Get him!" My team leader's like, "Get him!" I'll never forget, it was seriously like a movie. It was like Jason Bourne. I'm driving this Humvee, and I have the thing floored. Like, as far down as the pedal would go, if I could have put that pedal through the floorboard, I would have. And we're chasing this car, and I mean, we're going through like alleyways where like there's buildings on each side of us. I felt like we were gonna crash, and I seriously felt like a movie. Like as it was happening, I remember thinking, this is like a movie. Just chasing this car down, going as fast as we can, like it was so crazy. Eventually, the guy pulled into a house, and we ended up getting him, and we actually apprehended him, and we ended up turning him over to like our EPWs or whatever. So I don't ultimately know what happened to that guy, but no, we did go on like a 10-minute chase, of which I was the driver, and it was super cool. It was just super fun. It was like a movie, and it was neat. So yeah, so there was like a little bit of adventure, and again, I do think that actually happened in Fallujah, not so much Baghdad. But I didn't want you to think that my entire time spent there was just kind of, hanging out, drinking Uday's Goldschlager. We did some war fighting as well. Now, something that wasn't war fighting. When we were in Baghdad, we didn't live in the palace throughout the entire duration. At some point, we ended up moving, and my unit actually lived on an abandoned airfield. And we actually lived in like the control tower of this airfield. So many just crazy stories. So before I tell you the story I want to get to, and it's just a sort of embarrassing but interesting story. I should tell you that at the time we had a very established mission. So my unit owned, as we would call it, the Baghdad Central train station. So basically every night we would go and guard this train station, which is like a very important transportation hub of Baghdad. And I have so many just amazing memories of that train station, because there was 3 gentlemen who would guard this train station with us. And they were engineers, and not like train engineers, they were like mechanical, electrical engineers. They were highly well educated. I remember when I first met these gentlemen, they were older men, always dressed in suits, like very Western looking. And when I first met them, I remember thinking like, when I got to Baghdad, I thought like all of Iraqis were like undereducated, impoverished, just like behind the times. The typical sort of, not chauvinistic, but the sort of just American, almost like if you're not American, you're from some medieval times. And that's how I was, especially at 19. These guys weren't that. I remember when I first talked to these engineers, like I was expecting them to not, like I need a translator to talk to them. They spoke more eloquent English than me. And I remember asking one of them, I was like, "Where'd you learn to speak English so well?" And the guy was like, "Well, when I was doing my doctorate in Berlin or wherever. I don't remember the specifics of it, but basically he was like belittling me. He's like, yo kid, like you and your high school education, I've been like all around the world like getting my doctorate. So these 3 engineers, what they were is they knew that the Baghdad train station, once everything was established, it would be like a very important place. So they were kind of hedging their bet. And so they would hang out with us, and they were basically like the owners of the train station. And I got to become really good friends with those guys. Like I used to have dinner with them. I met their kids. We used to like go to their house and play PlayStation. Like when the electricity would work, we would do that. It's just crazy stuff. So every night we would guard this train station. We would basically just sit there, and we would just like literally like we would play cards with like one of the engineers of those 3 men. I remember specifically his name was Salam Salam, which in Arabic means like peace peace, which also means it's very hard to find him. Like I've been trying to Google him and see what became of him, but it's hard to find a name like Salam Salam when it has common parlance in the language. But I did actually find, like, I found an article that talked about Salam, and he is, like, as of a few years ago, he was working in the train station. But these were, like, and I can't totally tell you these guys were up to, you know, all good. Like, they were definitely mafioso, like, maybe not the most well-intended people, but for our purposes, they were helping us out. They helped us guard the train station, and they did us favors, just like we did favors for them. So we were guarding their train station, and so the Baghdad train station is like a train station. Like it's a literal like lobby. It was actually built by the British back when like Iraq was more of like an imperial sort of British enclave. So it had like marble floors, like fountains inside of it. None of this was operational at the time, but like it was all there. And in the backyard of the train station, which is huge, like many hundreds and hundreds of yards by hundreds and hundreds of yards wide, was all of these like dilapidated trains and railroad tracks, and then lots of tanks full of oil, and also lots of warehouses full of rice. I guess because of the sanctions that we had had prior to the war, there had been a deal where we would send in like foodstuffs like rice and very durable food, and the Iraqi government was supposed to distribute it, but apparently a lot of it ended up at the Baghdad train station, was just sitting there. So our main task was to keep people from looting. Like people were always trying to rob the train station of like its oil and its rice, and we were always in the backyard. When I say yard, I mean train yard. We were always in the back chasing people down, apprehending people, just getting rid of the riffraff, more or less. But we had fun. Like we used to play like chess against the people out front, like the engineers, and then the engineers had their own bodyguards, and they were crazy dudes, man. Like we had this one guy. I wish I could remember his name, but he was one of the engineers' bodyguards. And the interesting thing is, this is Baghdad, so there was alcohol. You could find alcohol. Like, obviously, the Iraqi government didn't condone the consumption of alcohol, but it was there. And so these guys, for us, what they would do is we would guard the train station, and they would bring us alcohol. So we would sit there and basically get drunk with these dudes. Basically shoot the stuff, you know, BS back and forth and just drink. One of the bodyguards I'll never forget, and it was a crazy emotional night, and we had just gotten pretty drunk, maybe drunker than we probably should have. We shouldn't have been getting drunk at all. I mean, that's against one of the major rules of the military, but it happened all the time. And one of these bodyguards, younger dude, he gets pretty wasted, and he's starting to get out of hand, which is kind of scary too, in a sense, because like we're all armed, and like as much as we trusted these people, at the same time, you are in a foreign country. But in any case, this guy takes off his shirt, and across his back he has whip marks, just scars, like the big, like when you see a movie about slavery back in the day, and like they use special effects to make the really thick scarring on a person's back from being lashed. He had that, and he was telling the story about like Saddam Hussein, like his police force had arrested him, put him in a box, and every time he would, like a very small box where he'd have to crouch down, and every time like he would have to stretch to just like get some relief, they'd whip him. So in hearing stories like that, that goes back to the story I was telling you about the kid I was holding, is there was periods of time where you really felt like you had done the country a big favor, because there were people who really hated Saddam Hussein. There were citizens in Iraq who hated Saddam Hussein. A lot of them also didn't like us. Like they would just as well have seen us leave too. But for the most part, it seemed like people were generally thankful that we got rid of Saddam. I think they also just wish that we would have just left just as quickly. But in hearing stories like that dude's story and seeing the scars on his back, pretty emotional, and it really made everything feel worthwhile for a point there. Anyway, so these dudes would get us alcohol all the time, and so this will bring you to the one sort of immature, crazy story I wanted to tell you about. So we had gotten a bunch of bottles of alcohol from the train station, and we had gone back to the airport where I was telling you that we lived. So this airport was like a regular airport, not like a commercial airport, but like a municipal airport. So we had lived in a control tower, and on the bottom floor was like all the commanders. So basically, anytime you came in and out of the building, you had to pass the brass. And then we lived up on like the top floor. So it was really hard to sneak around them. But they were always doing their thing. Like, they weren't paying attention to us. We'd walk in and they were doing their thing. But it's an airport, so there's a runway. So one night, my teammates and I, we had this alcohol, and we decided that we were going to, for whatever reason, like, we were given pretty good leeway when we weren't on a mission. We were able to do whatever we kind of wanted. People weren't paying attention. So we went to the far end of the runway, and we decided we're going to have like a party. We're just going to get wasted, and it was going to be fun, and we were telling stories, and the night started innocent enough. This was crazy. We were drinking, and basically it's just, I'm not sure if there was other trucks with us, but our truck was definitely there, so it was my team leader, my gunner, and then me. And then as the driver of the truck, I felt like I owned the truck. Like, when you're a driver of a Humvee in Iraq, it's a source of pride. You do all the maintenance on the truck. And like me, I felt like I went above and beyond. Like, I always did preventative maintenance. I always felt like our truck was in tip-top shape. I was always, like, I really took being the truck's driver super seriously. Even though it wasn't the most respected job in the world, like, to me, it was a huge deal. So we get really wasted, and the night starts so well. I remember all the stories we were telling. We're talking about when we get back to home, we're going to be so appreciative of the United States, and we were just getting really drunk and nostalgic, and like just having this real bonding time with your teammates, and it was like an indelible thing in my heart. It started out so innocently. And we were just like, we'd start telling these stories about like, well, what if we had to go to war with North Korea? What will that be like? Like, I remember this whole night just so well. It started like, it almost was like you're in a bar in the States and you're just telling stories. But then I got drunk. I mean, I got really drunk. I think I drank a whole bottle of some liquor and something else, and I was just hammered. And we had to drive back to like the tower where we lived. And of course, like, it's my truck. I've always driven. I'm always the driver. And I said, I'm driving. And my team leader is like, no, you're way too drunk to be driving, even in Iraq. And I was blacked out. I'll never forget, like, he tried to tell me I couldn't drive. And even though I was blacked out, I do remember this. And I started driving anyway. Like, he jumped in front of the truck, and like, I almost threatened to run him over. He ended up, so my team leader was this big buff dude. I haven't taken a whole lot of beatings in my life, but he beat the living out of me. Like, he destroyed me because first of all, I tried running him over. Second of all, I was belligerent. I wouldn't get out of the driver's seat. He beat me so badly for my own good. I don't know how I got back to the control tower, but I swear to you, this is a true story. The next thing I know, I wake up. I slowly open my eyes and I can't see anything. I'm hungover. I feel sick. I am like, what is going on? And everyone's looking at me and they're like, you don't move. Like, you don't go nowhere. You lay in this bed, you go nowhere. My eyes were swollen over. Like, I had gotten beaten. And plus, I was just hungover looking. Like, my teammates weren't so worried about getting called out for having beaten the living crap out of me. They were afraid of getting in trouble with alcohol. So somehow they had snuck me past the brass. And then for like 3 days straight, like, they wouldn't let me leave. Like, they told me to stay up in that top room and like pretend like I was sick. And anytime I wanted to walk around, I had to wear thick sunglasses, and just like, it was the most hush hush thing, but it was bad. Like, we could have gotten in so much trouble. It was so irresponsible. But again, it shouldn't have been irresponsible. Like, it's one thing to go out and drink and party, and like, even though you aren't supposed to, you could get away with it if you had some responsibility. But when you're me, and you always take things to the extreme, you manage even to sort of mess that one up. And I did. But nothing ended up becoming of it. it's a memory that's stuck with me, and I'll never forget how drunk we got and getting the one massive beating of my life, and probably the most deserved beating of my life. It occurred in Baghdad, so I'll always have that. All right, we're getting up to like an hour of me telling stories here, so I want to start rapid fire shooting through some things here. A really cool interaction I had, like you probably know from following this series, I have a fascination with the special forces. And there's going to be a video log or a video episode where you hear about how not making special forces has been a huge influence on my life and has shaped everything that has come since then. But in Baghdad, I had a cool interaction with the special forces guys because one of my best friends in my unit was actually a Palestinian kid. Ethnically, I think he was Palestinian. In any case, ethnically, he was Middle Eastern. So he spoke Arabic. He was actually born in Puerto Rico, so he spoke Spanish also, and he was raised in Wisconsin. So as far as like in my head, like I'd always make this joke, like if you're talking about mutt, but super talented dude. So he could speak fluent Arabic, fluent Spanish, so he's a valuable asset. And as soon as we got to Baghdad, basically the Special Forces guys came over from 5th Special Forces Group. Somehow they got wind of my teammate, or my platoon mate, and they came down on orders and said, guess what, he's no longer yours, he's ours. So my buddy got reassigned to the Special Forces, the 5th Special Forces Group, and he became like theirs. Like he became their asset. And the cool part about that is we actually got to go visit him, and it gave me an insight to how the Special Forces guys lived relative to how we live, because at the time we were actually living in the airport like I was just describing, and so we had to go meet up my buddy for some reason. We had to like take some paperwork to him or something. So we go out in this mission to go to the Special Forces house, which is actually in this neighborhood of Baghdad called the Mansur district, which even to this day, if you were to Google, is like the real rich, affluent neighborhood of Baghdad. And so basically, again, some of these memories are so crystal clear in my head. So we roll up in our Humvees. So we're like all professional, like in a 3-truck convoy with like one person up on the gun, like ready for anything. We're all in our equipment, helmet on, flak jackets. We pull up to this house, like we pull through security, and we're expecting like soldiers to come out, like super soldiers. The first person who comes out of the house to greet us is wearing shorts, and he has a Hawaiian t-shirt on. It's like unbuttoned, he has a big beer belly, and we're like, who in the heck are you? And this guy's like, I'm Joe, or whatever. I made that name up. And he's like, I'm the team leader, or I'm the team sergeant. Like, I run this joint. And that's how they lived. Like, they were doing very important missions. Like, they were, I guess I don't know what their mission set was, but when it comes to the best of the best, they were it. But when it came to chilling out, those dudes, like, we were always in uniform. Those dudes were in, like, t-shirts and shorts. We actually got to go into their house. You have to remember at the time, like, we didn't have internet. We didn't have satellite phones. We had nothing. We get into their house. You first walk in to the left-hand side. They had armory. The first thing I remember seeing is a big, like, huge sniper rifle. You get past that. You cut off to the left. They had an indoor swimming pool. And there was a balcony overlooking this swimming pool. And I guess there was, like, a fence that went around the balcony. And they had knocked down the fence, and they used that to dive into the pool. So they had, like, a working pool inside their house. Outside the house, they had a V12 Mercedes. I don't know where they got that, but they had it. They had a fridge full of beer. They had an office with like all kinds of internet office equipment. Just a totally different world. So like if you have a natural sort of fascination with the Special Forces guys, and then you're in Baghdad and you know how you're living relative to how they're living, your interest in that lifestyle just goes up dramatically. So that was my interaction with those guys. I ended up finding out that house, after they left, got overrun by Iraqis. Because again, it's crazy. For like that 2 or 3 week period, Baghdad was secure and safe. But when it collapsed quickly, and it became hell on earth in like no time. But my experience in Baghdad was more of it being like a Western city than like anything else. So I'm trying to think if there's, let me run through my notes real quick. I definitely want to tell you about like the Special Forces guys living in Mansur. I wanted to tell you about my crazy drinking story. A lot about Uday's house, stuff like that. The RPG that went under the truck. Really, the only other thing I want to tell you about is just where our mind was at the entire time. it's hard for me to explain this to you now because it just won't make as much sense, but you have to remember that when we first deployed to Kuwait, we thought we were going there for 6 months. We had no idea we were going to war. When we left for Kuwait, war was nowhere in our scope of thought. And then, on the day of our 6 months, so we actually deployed for Kuwait September 20th of 2002. We rolled into Iraq on March 19th and March 20th of 2003, exactly 6 months later. So this entire time, we just want to go home. That's all we wanted to do was go home. And everything that we would do, that was like the carrot at the end of the stick, is they would always be like, the quickest way home is through Baghdad. And they're like, if you take Baghdad, we'll send you home. And then they were like, the quickest way home is through Fallujah. You take Fallujah, we'll send you home. And it was just like, every time we thought we were going home, they were like, the quickest way home is through such and such. And like I truly remember, it was, so you have to think, we got into Iraq in March. So a couple months later, we had been in Baghdad. We hadn't gotten to Fallujah yet. And we were living there. And our battalion commander held this big formation. And his big announcement was, he was like, I can't wait to celebrate the 4th of July, Independence Day. And I promise you, we'll be celebrating it in Fort Stewart, Georgia. And that just made us all like, we'll be home for 4th of July. Yeah, so exciting. And I remember going on a mission. And then one day we came back from this mission. I don't remember the specifics of the mission itself, but I remember getting back to our base. I think it was at the airfield. And everyone just looked glum. It was like you walked in and it just looked like everyone, you could just feel the sadness in the air. It was like thick. And you knew it. Like as soon as I walked into this building, I was like, we're not going home. Like I remember it. Like you walked into it, like you could feel the heartbreak. And this is after the announcement that we'd be back for 4th of July. And it was getting closer and closer to the 4th of July, so we were like, we should be finding out about going home. And that's, like, I got home from that mission, and that night they were like, Frago, which is like a fragmentation order, which basically means like additional missions. Your next mission set is to go and take Fallujah. And that's when we found out about that mission, and that was our next step on our route home. But that's a whole different story. So, and I'll never blow up. Like, I didn't really, my interaction with Fallujah, I know Fallujah is like a hot point. My interaction with it was on the very periphery, and I'll tell you those stories one day. My interaction of like with real combat was actually in Ramadi, not so much Fallujah, but those are all stories for a different episode. And with that, I think I have probably used more time than you guys really wanted to allow me. But I hope you got some sense of what Baghdad was like back in 2003. It's actually my life dream, and I really, really mean this. So I have a fascination with the Middle East. As you might know if you watch some of these other episodes, after my tour, or after my time in the service, I went to college and I actually studied Middle Eastern culture. I actually took a couple semesters of Arabic. I took a bunch of classes on Islam, and my degree is actually in international studies and religious studies. And truly, my dream is to go back to Iraq. I really want to go back to Iraq. Really, really want to go back to Iraq. Hopefully it'll get to a point. Like right now, I think if you were to go up to like Kirkuk or the northern part of Iraq, you're probably pretty safe. I know it's even like a tourist destination in some sense, but like I want to go back. I want to go back to Baghdad. It's like my life dream. I really, really want to. And hopefully things will work out so I can do that at some point. So hopefully that'll shake itself out, and that'll be an opportunity that I'll have at some point. But in any case, so that tells you a bit about 2003 Baghdad. Drawing this one to a close, I want to remind you guys that, like I said, there's a website now, maxresistanceblog.com. So check that out. Click on all the social media links, add me everywhere. Get in touch with me if there's anything you want me to talk about. If you want to complain about how bad this vlog is, whatever. The world is yours. But in any case, I'm enjoying doing this, and I'll continue doing it. And I hope you'll stick with it. Please subscribe to the channel. And I think that does it for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.